Right now we're going to talk to Kirsty Clark, who's a whisky expert, I'm delighted to say, because I'm quite partial to a bit of the old whisky.
Yep.
She's going to be telling us about why certain whisky makers are getting a bit upset about all the rules and regulations in Scotland, and they're thinking about setting up elsewhere.
Well, not just setting up, some of them have. Some of them have gone south of the border and set up in England to produce Scotch whisky.
Well, let's find out what it's all about. Kirsty, very good afternoon to you.
Hi, good afternoon, guys. How are you?
Yeah,
Hi,
very well.
Kirsty. Thank you for joining us.
Now, what is this?
Thank you for having me.
What is going on in Scotland, and why are they being so kind of, shall we say, red tape bound with all these rules and regulations?
Well, like a lot of food that has protected status, like your champagne and your Milton Mowbray pies, etc., the Scottish Whisky Association is there to protect Scotch whisky in particular. Whisky does come from many places. You've obviously got Irish whisky. Whisky's been made in England, not just by Paul and obviously the Lakes Distillery. And come across the world, Japan is obviously very hot property at the moment for whisky. So Scottish Whisky Association is a governing body that rules what can and can't be called Scotch, so that nobody else can go ahead and trade on its name. But with that comes certain regulations. So Paul used to, along with his dad, have a distillery called the Allen Distillery and was involved in starting that and produced Scotland and whisky for a long time and has now started up a distillery in the Lakes, which, although is making whisky, has not yet produced any of its own whisky. But being over the border in England, there's no boundaries of the SWA, so they can pretty much do what they like in terms of experimenting.
But they can't call it Scotch, though, can they?
That's right. No, you can't call it Scotch. Scotch can only be made in Scotland under the same regulations, which are the type of cask and how long it has to be aged for.
OK, so what will they call it? Just whisky?
Yeah, they'll call it whisky.
Right.
So it'll still be bottled as whisky, if that's what they want to go ahead and call it, and it'll obviously have the information on the label as to what makes it different.
I see. Now, Kirsty...
you got Irish whisky, right?
Oh, you got Irish
whiskey.
bourbon.
Irish
Sure.
whisky,
all of that.
Whisky of an E.
Are they allowed to spell it without the E?
No, Irish whisky is always spelled with the E, and that's usually how you know the difference between the two.
Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, the stuff they're making in England, which is meant to be Scotch, can they call that whisky without the E?
They could do. They will call it whisky without the E, and that'll be what happens with that, but they won't be able to call it Scotch whisky.
No, can they call it English whisky?
Yeah, there's already a company out there, the English Whisky Distillery,
right.
Are out there making whisky in England and have been producing for a while now.
That's brilliant.
You wouldn't want to buy English whisky, though, would you?
Well, you'd taste it first, wouldn't you, and then find out and say, wow, this is not bad.
I mean, as a marketing aspect, you don't want to call it English, do you?
Well, I don't know, the Japanese produce a lot of whisky now, don't they, Kirsty?
Yeah, they do. Japan is very popular at the moment. Japanese whisky is a big deal, and there's also some really good Indian whisky out there at the moment.
Indian whisky, I hadn't thought about that.
John whisky is made in India. The peat comes from Scotland, gets flown over to India, where they actually make the whisky and then bring it back over again.
Yes.
You can actually find Paul Johns in Marks and Spencer's.
Kirsty, can I ask you one point, please? And this is historical, really. I understand that one of the issues is what you store the whisky in, i.e. which sort of wood the barrels are made of.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest regulations and one of the most important impacts on whisky itself really is where all of the flavour comes from. Yeah. And that's the barrel. And under the SWA regulations, it needs to be an oak barrel.
Right, I see. But now in England, they're talking about using maple and all sorts of things, aren't they?
That's right, yeah. They won't be the first people to do that.
Yeah.
There's the Swedish whisky Macmira. They use birch, juniper, many different types of wood. And have sometimes the results are really good. Sometimes they're not so much. And touching on a point earlier on that was mentioned with would you want to use the fact it was English whisky and marketing, it really depends when you look at it. For too long, the reputation has been built up on the thinking of what's behind the whisky, what's in the barrel, rather than actually tasting the whisky. And it's really, really important to go out and try whisky. It's never been so popular. There's a massive boom at the moment.
Right.
So many whiskies from so many areas, and the best thing you can do is just taste as much as you can.
And see what happens.
We do like to do a bit of that. Porky only 1/3 of his heart work, so he doesn't like to drink too much whiskey.
Well,
but
that's right.
I had some very nice whiskey over the course of the Christmas period.
You? Yeah.
They're also making a lot of gin in Scotland now as well, aren't they?
Again, that goes quite hand in hand with the amount of distillers that are being made. As whisky can't be sold until it's at least 3 years old, they need something to be able to bring money in, and gin obviously has no real distillation time. It's also very hot at the moment, lots of botanicals being used and new experimentation. So a lot of whisky distilleries can quite easily produce gin on the side to bring in an income while allowing the whisky to lay, being aged for longer but still getting in an income.
That's right. And is it historically true, Kirsty, that the reason whisky is the colour it is in Scotland, because of course some Irish whiskey, Potgene, is clear. Is it because
Potgene isn't whiskey, though.
Yeah, is it because the barrels in which the whiskey was brought back to this country from overseas were sherry barrels, which had taken sherry, formerly on other journeys, and then filled full of whiskey, which turned it brown?
Well, barrels are really the key to everything about whiskey. The cask is really important, and that's where all of the colour and all the flavour is imported from. So when spirit comes off the stills, and then the new make, it's completely clear. It then goes into the barrel, and all the colour it takes comes from the oak itself and what's been inside it.
That's amazing.
So usually a darker whiskey will be a sherried whiskey, whereas also bourbon whiskies will also colour. And sometimes you used to be able to use colour very much as an indication of age, but things have changed nowadays with the way that whiskey is distilled and its conditions, and anything can change the colour. Sometimes artificial colours are added by some whiskey makers because it used to be thought the darker the whiskey, the better the whiskey, because it was believed it would be older.
Sure.
But that really isn't the case. I've had some very light whiskies that are very old and pack tremendous flavour.
Yeah.
So you can't really go on just colour alone anymore. You've really got to take the whiskey as a whole. But yes, certainly sherry whiskies do tend to be darker because it's got more of the natural sherry colouring in it.
Amazing.
Excellent.
Amazing.
Well,
Thank
Kirsty,
you very much indeed, Kirsty.
Tell us about your website, Whisky Corner, before we leave you.
Yeah, Whisky Corner, which is www.whiskycorner.co.uk, is run by myself and Stuart Cragon, my partner, and we write about whiskey. I've had articles published. We run festivals and attend many PR events for whiskey and do a lot of tasting notes from the distilleries and just basically really geek out on whiskey all the time. And I like to write a few articles that aren't always well thought of. Well, they usually they go down very well, but they've got a lot of my own opinions on it. I'm not shy and say
excellent.
what I
You've got to
think.
tell us about the next time you do a tasting. We'll come along.
Indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Or we'll come and give you a tasting. And
Okay.
we'll tell you everything you need to know.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sounds good to me. We'll get
Absolutely.
some whiskey drinking going on in the studio.
And
which is no
there's
bad thing.
whiskey in the jar.
Yeah.